Boldwood presents The Wrong Man, written by Amanda Brookfield and read by Sophie Dora Hall. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. 1992, Chapter 1. As Pippa pushed open the rusting black gate, its lopsided hinge emitted a strangled screech that sent tiny vibrations shooting down into the roots of her teeth. After a few moments of standing at the front door, she remembered that Jane and Michael's bell no longer worked, and rapped briskly on the splintery wood. Pippa's own home, an airy four-bedroomed Edwardian house in Dulwich, was lovingly repainted and cleaned in a methodical way throughout each year, so she could not resist a silent tut-tut or two at the sight of the Lyttons' obvious neglect of their own property. But at the same time, she loved and almost admired them for it. It took courage to neglect things, she sometimes thought, a courage which she lacked completely. "Coming!" shouted Jane from somewhere deep inside the house. Pippa got out her handbag mirror to check her bun. Her hair was so fine that it slipped out of the pins and clasps, no matter how many she applied. She smiled quite warmly at her reflection, not out of vanity. She was not beautiful, her nose was too pointy and her mouth too thin, but because she was happy. She always enjoyed taking time out of her carefully constructed bustle of domesticity to visit Jane and the children in all their glorious chaos, and on this occasion she had some rather exciting news to impart when the moment was right. The door burst open, giving Pippa a snapshot impression of the familial warmth and brightness within. "Heavens!" exclaimed Jane, pushing her thick dark fringe from her eyes and hoiking baby Harriet higher onto her hip. "Is it 11 already? Oh, lovely to see you, Pip. Come in. Mind the trains. Tom has spent all morning building the longest train in the world, haven't you, love?" She stooped to stroke her son's messy brush of hair before leading the way through to the kitchen. "You look well, Pippa. You make me feel a total wreck," which I am. Roll on the spring term. Coffee or tea? Oh, I'd love some tea. But more than that, she wanted to hold Harriet, who was pudgy and square and smiley. "Could you take the baby, do you think?" Jane, who knew of the Crofts' fruitless and now abandoned quest to have a child of their own, was never sure whether to push her offspring onto Pippa or keep them at bay. "I almost burnt Harriet with a kettle once, trying to juggle cups and things. It was when the health visitor was here, which was lucky, if you see what I mean." Jane moved deftly round her cramped but cosy kitchen, the soles of her black plimsolls squeaking on the cracked linoleum floor. Being so petite, she had a tendency to make Pippa, who was by no means tall, feel clumsy and large. She wore a green hairband that morning, a thin strip of dark velvet that did little to control the glossy jumble of her hair, but which drew attention to the brilliant emerald of her eyes, so deeply set into the pale, elfin face. Pippa had always thought Jane very striking to look at, not in a way that made her. To manage to look scruffy but attractive was an achievement far beyond Pippa's own aspirations, as was Jane Lytton's way of appearing higgledy-piggledy but happy. Pippa knew herself to be incapable of reconciling such opposites. For her, happiness was impossible without orderliness, just as attractiveness was out of the question without a good deal of thought and attention to detail. The little L-shaped kitchen always reminded Pippa of a fully equipped caravan. Everything was reachable and functioning so long as it stayed in its correct place. One thing left out, or put away badly, threw the whole system into chaos. Tom's paintings, together with innumerable creations made out of tin foil, cardboard and string, filled every inch of space between the bulging cupboards and shelves, giving the effect of some crazy wallpaper of modern art. Along the windowsill, which overlooked the back garden, several trailing plants fought for space amongst pots of herbs, cookery books and a large bowl, overflowing with safety pins, paper clips and rubber bands. "Any news of the extension?" she inquired brightly. Ever since the Lyttons had moved to Cobham, a couple of years before, they had been talking of building on at the back. Jane sighed. "Oh, I don't know, Pip. It's so much money. Michael says we'd be better off moving again, but it's a bad time to sell because the economy is so rubbish. We just go round in circles when we talk about it. I've rather given up, to be honest." She sat down at the small pine table opposite Pippa and stirred milk into their mugs of tea. Thinking about the extension only made her cross. The move out of London had been her idea to begin with, but Michael had got very enthusiastic in the end. They both fell in love, as she remembered it, with the cottagey feel of number 23 Meadowbrook Road, and had enjoyed making plans to improve and enlarge it. But when their requests for planning permission ran into trouble, Michael started to go sour on the whole project. His recollection of their house-moving episode was now based on the belief that Jane had pressurised him into making a decision before he was ready. Perhaps she had. Perhaps he was right. Jane wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure about a lot of things. Well, Tim said that Michael is keen on going ahead, even though you've still only got permission to add on one room. Really? Jane wondered if other wives found out quite so much of their husbands' thoughts from other people. She laughed quickly, before issuing an automatic excuse for her ignorance. Michael's been working very hard recently. It makes him absent-minded. I keep telling him he'll leave his head at the office one day, and not just his briefcase. At least that bank of his has eased up on the travelling side of things. When Tim's gone, it's for a week at a time. His trips are longer than the holidays he's selling. Pippa sighed. I do get lonely, you know, she added in a bleating baby voice to Harriet, who looked puzzled, and put Pippa's amber necklace in her mouth by way of a response. She's teething, as you can see, said Jane, offering her daughter a rusk. She hoped Pippa was not going to start on about the wearing demands of travel mania, the tourist business that Tim had started after leaving the city. Pippa was unremittingly sweet, but prattled on a bit sometimes, in the way that some people did if they had no burning commitments in the hours ahead. During the early years of their acquaintance, when Jane had not progressed much beyond filing tasks for Morton's publishers, Pippa had an enviably pressurised job as the PA to the managing director of a prestigious London advertising agency. But after a couple of years of failing to conceive a child, Pippa's doctor had warned that stress at work might be taking its toll on her hormones and recommended that she take a break. Though her resignation from the agency was billed very much as a temporary measure, taken for prudence's sake alone, it somehow became permanent and, like the desire for babies that had prompted it, impossible to discuss. The instant success of Tim's business seemed to erase the last traces of a possibility that Pippa might return to work. She even started hinting with wry little smiles that Tim would disallow such a thing, as if it had become one of those male pride issues that she had decided to indulge rather than resist. While Pippa talked about Tim's long absences, Jane tried but failed to keep her mind from drifting upstairs to the 5 or 6 loads of washing that lay strewn across the landing and bedroom floors, together with the thought of Tom's wet mattress which needed scrubbing and drying before the smell of pee was completely absorbed into its soft foam interior. As her musings moved on to an alarmingly broad shopping list of food, clothes and shoes, she began to wonder vaguely why Pippa had been so insistent on inviting herself over, and how long she was planning on staying. Since their relationship had arisen from the long-standing friendship between their husbands, rather than any instinctive liking for each other, what intimacy they managed never felt entirely natural. Having quietly wished Pippa was gone, Jane immediately felt guilty and invited her to stay for lunch. Oh, I'd love to, if I won't be in your way. Harriet was wriggling impatiently, clearly bored with her allotted lap and looking for new distractions. Soggy rust stuck in blobs to her face and bib. A few gooey fingerprints were visible on Pippa's fluffy jumper. She tried to wipe them with a tissue when Jane wasn't looking, but Jane had already seen and was ready with a damp cloth and apologies on behalf of her daughter. Silly of me to wear it, I know. It was certainly a little optimistic to visit this house in such a lovely thing. Jane touched the soft grey wool with the back of her hand, suddenly conscious of the grubbiness of her own sweatshirt and faded jeans. Tim gave it to me. It's got llama in it or something. He brought it back from Peru. My birthday, she added shyly. Jane clapped a hand over her mouth. Oh, Pippa, I forgot. You should have told me. Oh, no, I feel awful. Pippa was blushing, regretting a little that she had dared to mention it. Oh, it's only a wretched birthday. 38 is not exactly a reason to celebrate, especially not in my case. But of course it matters. I mind terribly about my birthdays. I love presents and being taken out to dinner and all that sort of thing. Jane stopped quickly, remembering that her birthday that year had been quite horrible. It was a Saturday. Tom, wanting to mark the occasion, Michael had to be forced not to go down and intervene while the smell of burnt toast curled its way up the stairs. The toast was quite black, heaving with butter, but otherwise okay. The boiled eggs had been put into water in a saucepan but never boiled. Jane, who was relieved that Tom had heeded 6 years of warnings about never touching the knobs on the stove, even given the desire to cook an egg, bravely cut the top of her runny offering and dipped a wedge of the charcoaled bread into the grey-yellow slime. Tom stood in solemn silence, watching from the end of the bed. Tom, said Michael, you haven't cooked the eggs. This isn't cooked, see? He picked up his egg and held it out. It's still cold. When you cook something, it goes hot. But these are all liquid inside, so Mummy and I can't eat them. But Mummy, charged with a fierce reflex of protective love, was spooning large dollops of the phlegmy offering into her mouth and rolling her eyes with pleasure. Jesus, Jane, how could you? Said Michael with a laugh. You'll be sick. He turned back to his son, still smiling. Well tried, Tom. Just ask for help next time, OK? But it was not OK, as Jane had known it would not be. Tom's day was ruined. Her day was ruined. Just one mouthful would have been enough, just one mouthful for love's sake. But he wasn't like that, her husband. Michael liked things one way or another, black or white, like his tables of figures at work. If something wasn't cooked that was meant to be cooked, you didn't eat it, whatever the circumstances. Such an attitude no doubt worked wonders in meeting rooms, when heady negotiations for debt rescheduling and long-term loans hung in the balance, but it did not do so well at home. Mike, who felt it was wrong to be chastised for honesty, said that Jane, as usual, was being overprotective of their firstborn, refused to melt and admit he had been wrong. Jane, out of some kind of inverted revenge, refused to go out to dinner. Michael ate bread and cheese watching telly while she pretended to read upstairs. "There's nothing more depressing than a bad birthday," Jane told Pippa firmly, shaking off the memory. "I bet Tim's got something lovely lined up for tonight. He usually gets tickets for a show or something, but he never lets on to the last minute, one of those funny rituals we long-married couples go through. Though actually..." Pippa got up to look out of the window, her fingers fiddling absently with the yellow beads of her necklace. "Tim has been a little moody recently. I know he's a bit of a one for sulks, not like Michael at all, but this time I really feel something is up." She eyed Jane, who was stacking the dishwasher very busily behind her. "He hasn't said anything to Michael, I suppose?" "Not that I know of." Jane pulled a bottle of white wine out of the fridge door. "Let's celebrate just a little. It's only supermarket stuff, but quite nice. I've got lots of tail ends of smelly cheeses to go with it. A birthday lunch of sorts." "You're very kind, Jane. I don't know where I'd be without you." Such comments always threw Jane off balance, since she never felt able to respond in kind. Pippa was a friend, but not one that she relied on totally, not like Julia, say, whom Jane had known since school and whose presence in her life usually... Like Pippa, Julia had no children, but didn't mind at all. She was not married either, or even close to it. Having recently opened her own antique shop in North London, she was totally involved with that. With Pippa there had always been a subtle imbalance in the relationship, brought on by Pippa's at times embarrassing admiration for Jane's marriage to her husband's best friend. The fact that the Lyttons had managed to have children quite effortlessly only heightened Pippa's perception of their marital bliss, at the same time fostering a tick of awkwardness between the two women, which no amount of goodwill could entirely smooth away. They sat down to French bread and cheese, while Harriet slept and Tom watched Thomas the Tank Engine on the telly. "I made a big decision last week," blurted Pippa, now frantic to broach the subject beating in her head like a pulse. Jane sipped the wine, which was a little tart but pleasantly cold. "Something exciting?" "Very." Pippa cut off a wedge of brie and put her knife down. "I'm going to go for IVF. I know I always said I wouldn't, that if nature wouldn't take its course, it was wrong for us to interfere, but I've changed my mind." "Pippa, that's amazing!" Jane's mind floundered in search of appropriate words, wanting badly to say the right thing. "How terribly brave! What are the chances? Isn't it very expensive? Will it hurt? What does Tim think?" A couple of years previously, the Crofts had formally resigned from the ranks of would-be parents, confessing to close friends that the strain was too much and they wanted to concentrate on enjoying themselves instead. Though Jane had nurtured suspicions as to Pippa's true commitment to such a way of thinking, compared to Tim, who had shown unqualified relief at their decision, she never imagined her turning round with such a bold reversal of opinion. But on seeing the warm glow of hope in Pippa's round and usually quite solemn face, she was immediately thrilled for her. She wanted to be encouraging, to will her towards the outcome she craved. She reached out instinctively and touched her hand. "Oh, I do hope it works, Pip. You deserve it, of all people." Pippa's smile was brilliant. She pushed some wisps of her fine hair, glinting now with an occasional sliver of silver out of her eyes. "If points for trying count, we do deserve one, I suppose. I know this sounds terrible," she went on carefully, "but I think I would have liked to have had a miscarriage. I really would. Just one. I mean, at least it's closer to being pregnant. Whereas I'm just barren, like those women in the Bible, unblessed and infertile." "Oh, Pippa, don't say that. Anyway, some of those Bible women had babies when they were old and supposedly past it. And I'm starting to feel I'm nearly past it, which is why I've decided to take drastic action. It's now or never, Jane." Jane rummaged in the fridge for a bunch of grapes to add to their spread. "And Tim is all right about it, is he?" Pippa took a deep breath. "Tim doesn't know. Not yet." Jane stopped, bunch of grapes in hand. "That's a little fundamental, isn't it? Are you Jane knew they were on dangerous ground. The desire to have a child was totally primeval, unarguable once it took hold. She knew because Tom hadn't been planned, not for 1 second, and yet when she found out that she was pregnant, one drizzly morning 3 years into her marriage, she sensed at once that she was in the grip of a force far stronger than anything she had ever experienced. It was inconvenient to say the least, and certainly unwise. She was by then working as an editorial assistant. Michael had just started a phase of extensive travelling, and she felt very distant from him. He would come back exhausted but hungry for sex, pushing into her in a way he'd never had before, ungenerously, without tenderness. It was confusing. To be wanted in such a basic way was new to her. She was scared by the lovelessness of it all. Out of bed they ticked along as before, as if nothing had changed. It had made Jane start to wonder if love mattered after all, lying buried as it did, behind the daily negotiating and arguing of married life. But when Tom was conceived as the result of one such an emotional sexual encounter on a humid August night, after Michael had been on a business trip to Eastern Europe for 10 days, Jane decided at once that she should have the child. It felt like fate, out of her control entirely. And then, after the birth, it felt like love, the real thing, the thing she had always hoped to get from marriage. "Are you going to have any more?" asked Pippa, as Tom appeared, looking screen-dazed and pale. "No, I'm full, thanks, but you go ahead." "I mean children, silly, not cheese." They both laughed, which made Tom suspicious and needing an explanation. Jane was grateful for the deflection. It seemed mean to admit to Pippa, of all people, her certainty that she did not want any more children. Harriet, loved and treasured as she was, had been produced more for Tom's sake than anything else. Jane was very careful about contraception now, even when Michael was all rough and lustful. Chapter 2. Michael sipped his mineral water, enjoying the silent expectancy, the power he wielded in the meeting room. "It's not a question of if, Antonia, but when." He looked round the table of faces, knowing he now commanded their full attention. Antonia, a bristly and ambitious newcomer to the department, began making a few notes, to cover the moment of put-down. She wondered if Michael Lytton disliked her, whether his frequent challenges were personal or professional. "It's a market we can no longer ignore," went on Michael, deliberately looking at his watch to show that he felt the meeting should draw to a close. "I'd like to see detailed data on investment opportunities relevant to our special interest by the end of the week. Antonia, perhaps you would like to head up that research?" She nodded, not sure whether to be pleased or offended. It would be a lot of work, but then there was the enticing prospect of earning brownie points by doing it. Everyone began packing away their papers and shuffling out of the room. "You are happy to take on this job, are you?" She looked round in surprise, having thought the room. "Good. If you need any help getting started, don't hesitate to knock on my door." "Thank you." With a quick smile, he left the room, leaving Antonia with a blurred impression of businesslike kindness, riding on whiffs of strong aftershave. Michael sauntered back to his office, with his hands in the trouser pockets of his double-breasted suit, whistling quietly through the tiny gap between his 2 front teeth. It was a noise he made when he was happy, when life played into his hands and he felt in control of its multifarious demands. Adrenaline still pumped through his veins from the meeting, from handling it, and the prickly but promising Antonia Fielding, so well. Although it was Friday night, he felt in no hurry to head home, wanting instead to climb down more gradually from the high generated by a hard but successful week's work. A quick drink in the bar they all used, a half a bitter with some colleagues, before heading back to Cobham. The idea was tempting. As Michael made his way along the maze of plush neon-lit corridors that linked the offices of his firm of city bankers, like sections of a honeycomb, he tried not to think about the journey home. He dreaded the swarms of rushing commuters, the crush on the train, the 15-minute walk the other end. It had been mad to move out of London, extension or no extension. Their next move, when the market picked up, was going to be right back in again. He would see to that. Never mind Jane's rural idyll. It was totally impractical, unless one could afford a flat in London as well. But Michael did not relish that idea either. He had never liked being on his own, and had no desire to revert back to a part-time bachelor existence of cheese on toast and baked beans out of a tin while watching junk on the telly. Home life might be noisy and grating at times, but there were many comforts that made up for it. In the end, he persuaded John Proctor to have one for the road, but then a few others joined them and they decided to make it 2. As Michael was on the point of leaving, the MD himself strolled in and started asking how far his department had got in looking at the Polish market. Feeling on the ball and superbly able, Michael updated him at length, before rushing back into the office to leave a note on Antonia's desk, asking to have her presentation ready 3 days earlier than he had originally said. "Tom waited up for you." "You shouldn't let him. I've told you before. You said you'd be early." "Did I?" Michael frowned, having genuinely forgotten the promise that was lightly made by him but hungrily received by his son. "I got held up. Things began to happen just as I was leaving." Jane, who had heard all the excuses many times before, mechanically set about laying the table and serving food. She wasn't in the least bit hungry. The meat had held up well, but the baked potatoes were hollow and tough, their skins like cracked leather. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Michael didn't like it if she ate and went to bed without him. "It was Tom's concert," she said. "He did his solo on the recorder." "Oh, shit." Michael, who was ravenous, spoke with his mouth full. He chewed vigorously and swallowed before continuing. "Jane, love, I'm sorry." He reached out and put his hand on her arm. She continued eating very slowly, putting only the smallest amounts in her mouth, a flake of potato. She did not want to forgive him. The pattern was all too familiar. The repetitiveness of it all depressed her immensely. Last time it had been a parents' evening. Next time it would probably be the carol concert. "It doesn't matter." Jane pulled her hands onto her lap and fiddled with her wedding rings. One of the many tiny gold claws holding a small diamond in place on the engagement one had begun to stick upwards. Sharp as a needle, it sometimes caught on things like scarves and jumpers. She pressed it now, hard, into the top of one of her fingers, feeling it a great distance from the pinpoint of pain. "I'll apologise to Tom in the morning. Was he very upset?" Michael took another mouthful. She was honest enough to hesitate before answering. Tom wasn't a child who got very obviously upset. At the tender age of nearly 6, he had already developed a daunting capacity for suppressing his emotions. Jane knew about his feelings from the way he walked, the set of his face, the funny voices he used. He didn't say much about it, but he wouldn't eat his supper. An urge to scream suddenly pressed at the back of her throat. She wanted to yell, to blast the words out that of course Tom minded, because a promise had been made and broken again. Because he barely saw his father, and when he did, he was often critical and cross. But such outbursts, she knew from experience, got them nowhere. Michael would rant for a while about how much he slaved for his family and how little understanding he got in return, and then follow this up with a hurt silence that could last for days. She always ended up having to make the peace. "Jane, I've said I'm sorry." His big brown eyes took on the soulful look he used, to tell her it was time to step down and relent. "Work is crazy at the moment." He mopped up the last of his gravy with a piece of bread and wiped his hands and mouth on the oven glove that lay on the table beside them. "Work is always crazy," she said quietly, leaving the room to look up the house and go to bed. Michael, feeling guilty but cross with his wife for being the instrument of that guilt, stayed in the kitchen for much longer than he really wanted, looking at a catalogue of home furnishings that had been put through their letterbox the week before. Jane didn't throw newspapers and magazines away until the house threatened to be overrun by the damn things. Michael hit the glossy pages at the back of his hand in a sudden rush of frustration, causing the magazine to fall to the ground with a slap. He stared down at a chic sitting room of navy blue and sandy yellow, complete with a designer mother and child playing happily on a colour-coordinated hearth rug. Engulfed in the bright squash of his own home, Michael felt a rush of despair. When, if ever, did the gulf between how one wanted life to be and how it really was begin to narrow? He wondered bitterly. Upstairs, Jane had left his bedside light on, laid out his pyjamas on the pillow and turned on her side to sleep. But in spite of her closed eyes and the quietness, there was an atmosphere of unease in the room, generated by their conversation over dinner and all the things that the two of them had thought but failed to say. "Are you awake?" "Hmm?" She curled herself up more tightly into a ball, wanting very much to be left alone. But Michael wanted reassurance, master in his own home even, though he would never have put it like that himself. He turned on his side so that he was facing her curved back. After tracing one finger down the ridges of her spine, he reached across her, his hand seeking her breasts. Jane kept her arms folded into her, protectively. She felt the hand arrive, knew what it sought, and curled up more tightly still. Not now, she thought. Please, not now. But the hand persisted, firmly pulling her arms out of the way, finding its way up under her nightdress, stroking, caressing, determined. Jane did not want to make love. She was tired and angry, but she was also resigned. An honest woman, a woman who loved her lover, would say no, she thought. But Jane, as she realised with a terrible self-loathing, had got beyond the point where such honesty felt possible. Michael pushed his knee between her legs and settled his weight upon her with a grunt of satisfaction. She turned her head away and closed her eyes as he started to move in the old familiar rhythm, while his hands stroked and kneaded in a show of giving pleasure, which lacked commitment and reflected his own needs rather than hers. "Did you enjoy that?" he asked sleepily afterwards, to put the seal on his warm sense of reassurance. "Yes," she lied, because she was tired and wanting to sleep, and because dishonesty was so much easier than truth. Chapter 3. Mattie could not remember when she last felt less like doing anything, let alone Sunday lunch in Cobham with big sister Jane and her inscrutable husband. Even to contemplate living in a place like Cobham seemed to Mattie, who had a terrible hangover and who had never lived further than a few tube stops from the West End, to reflect something close to insanity. But then, while being enormously fond of her sibling, she had never really understood Jane's motives for doing anything. She often thought that if their parents hadn't died, their car skidding on a sheet of black ice and into the wall of an old Roman bridge when Mattie was still in her teens, the two of them would have remained indifferent and distant. But the accident changed things for good. Ever since then, Jane had tried to look after her, or at least been there for her, even when she wasn't wanted. And Mattie, while resisting the sisterly mothering, was wise enough to be grateful, knowing that she would almost certainly have fallen apart without it. Her headache was particularly intense that morning, yet it was entirely usual for her to feel lousy on a Sunday. Indeed, a weekend without a throbbing head smacked of failure. Mattie, although almost 30, liked to dance, preferably in large nightclubs with strobe lights and the first drink free with your ticket. The anonymity of it appealed to her most of all. There were none of the hideous social rituals associated with the ill-fitting mould of her teenage years, of having to have partners or pauses between songs. To be safely alone, yet part of a symbiotic crowd, soothed Mattie's endless ruffles of insecurity. It was also very good for the figure, she found, to dance all night long, several times a week. Popping tablets, but then it was the tablets that gave such an edge to the atmosphere and energy of the thing. After taking 3 paracetamol and drinking a Coca-Cola, Mattie began to feel fractionally better. She ran a bath and dozed off in it for a few minutes, her head of crazy corkscrew curls trailing in the water like dank seaweed. The painful notion of mustering energy for organised movement was just beginning to peck at the edges of her consciousness, when the sound of someone tapping on one of the windows by her front door brought her fully awake. Mattie groaned, hastily putting on a toweling dressing gown and padding through her basement flat, dripping wet and full of yawns, to see Julia peering through the smeary glass of the porthole window into her kitchen. "You were expecting me, weren't you?" she called, tossing her astonishing curtain of shining fair hair over one shoulder and laughing at the sight of Mattie. "I'm giving you a lift to Jane and Michael's Sunday lunch, remember?" "Oh, yes. Thank you, and thank God. Come in, Mattie croaked, opening her door. "I'm nearly awake, I promise. Can you make coffee? I must do something about my face and hair. I can't face the world without a face." "Run along, I'll see to coffee," soothed Julia, who was used to Mattie and rather fond of her. "I just don't see why you had to invite them this weekend of all weekends. But I told you about it ages ago. Tom, you're spilling your drink." "And what do you mean this weekend of all weekends?" Michael shook the paper hard. "I could just do with some time. I don't know, Jane, you booked so much in. We could have gone away somewhere as a family." Jane almost laughed. They never went away anywhere, and certainly not over a weekend. Even their summer holidays were usually spent in Kent with Michael's father. Fond as she was of the old man in his comfortable old house, it irked her that they always ended up there, falling back on the easy option, the only one requiring neither money nor organisation. The year before, she had invested a considerable amount of energy in trying to sell Michael the idea of a family camping holiday, leading on the economy of it. But he wasn't a rubbing sticks together kind of chap, Michael had protested, and never would be. Jane sometimes looked at other families she knew and wondered enviously at their regular escapes to cottages and hotels in England and the rest of Europe. She knew that it wasn't really money or time that prevented her and Michael from doing similar things, but a fundamental lack of inclination, a sinister shadow within their marriage, like a dark smudge on an X-ray. "It's only my sister and Julia," she reminded him more gently, not wanting the day to face ruin so early on. "We haven't seen either of them for ages." "Nonsense. You and Julia are always jumping around doing those exercises together." Very rarely now, with us living down here. It's not jumping around anyway, it's yoga, and I haven't been for ages. Michael folded the newspaper neatly back together and crossed his arms. It's just the thought of enduring all you women that I find a little daunting. I tried to invite Tim and Pippa, but they were busy. Michael humphed and disappeared. As she cleared up the kitchen and set about peeling apples for the crumble, Jane seriously tried to think who else she could have invited to make Michael feel his own needs were being better catered for. She knew none of his work colleagues, since he had never invited any of them back to be entertained, even when they had lived in London. While Jane would have hated sweating over recipe books in the interest of pleasing the expensive palates of Michael's various bosses and their wives, she could not help wondering about it. The fact was that apart from Tim Croft and an old mate called Des, whom he rarely saw, no name sprang to mind, unless she counted Michael's younger brother, Christopher, who lived in Oxford, and to whom he'd never been particularly close. Jane, on the other hand, was on amicable terms now with several mums in the area, mainly through school and sitting in playgrounds, and would have loved to stretch some of these friendships to include husbands, but Michael was very resistant to such notions. He worked too hard to be bothered with any superficial socialising, he said, claiming to prefer spending what little spare time he had relaxing with his family. But as Jane heard Tom bang on the loo door and Michael's muffled roar of response from within, the notion of a relaxed family life seemed little more than a shimmering mirage, vanishing as quickly as it was glimpsed. The moment their two guests arrived, however, Michael came alive. Having spent the previous 2 hours pointedly burrowing through sheaves of work papers, much to the consternation of the children who wanted him to play, he leapt to his feet for Julia and Matty, issuing drinks and witty small talk as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And Jane marvelled, not for the first time, at how much more fluently he communicated with people he knew less well, people who offered no threat of intimacy. It was incredible, seeing him now with her sister and her best friend, his bad mood apparently forgotten, his face breaking into smiles that showed his handsome teeth and made them feel welcome. It was like watching a different person. Yet who was she to criticise the clicking of such switches? Everyone did it, Jane told herself, suppressing a twitch of something like envy. It was a long time since her husband had put on such an act for her. A blast of unseasonal February warmth made it just possible for them to take their after-lunch coffees outside on the patio, while Hattie napped and Tom let off a bit of steam. The garden was a simple rectangle in shape, not exceptionally large, but perfect for a family. At its far end, a treehouse, a sandpit and a long swing graced the outstretched limb of a small oak, filling the lumpy, unkept bit of lawn which ran alongside a tangle that had once been a vegetable garden. Matty sat cross-legged on the grass instead of a patio chair, blowing tremulous smoke rings at the bright blue sky and jigging her legs to some silent tune playing inside her head. Jane, watching the faint grey circles rise and fall apart on the chilly spring breeze, shivered as she shifted her chair nearer. Beside her, Michael and Julia talked in an animated way about the art of French polishing. "How are you, Matty?" she asked, the tone of her voice communicating the sincerity behind the question. "Oh, you know me, up and down." She fiddled with a dangling bit of skin near the cuticle of her left thumb. All of Matty's fingertips. Once upon a time, their mother had painted her nails with a thick repellent varnish called Stop and Grow, guaranteed to cure the habit. But Matty, being Matty, had pronounced the stuff to be delicious and feasted on her chipped fingernails with more cannibalistic fervour than ever. Jane smiled to herself as she remembered the episode and then immediately felt sad. Where had it gone? All that easy anger of childhood, when the things to fight against were so obvious, so deeply felt. Grown-up enemies and sorrows were so much more of a blur. There were no goodies and baddies anymore, just a confusion of feelings. "Have you been painting?" Matty squirmed and looked away. "Oh, not really. Too bloody knackered half the time. I'll do a bit in the summer, I expect, when the light is better. Still so dark in the evenings, by the time I get in from work anyway." She shook her dark curls and shot Jane a mischievous grin, out of nowhere, causing her sister a familiar but painful stab of motherly emotion. "I become a movie junkie. I curl up on the sofa with my duvet and a few bars of chocolate. It's great." Jane, knowing that Matty was probably seeking a reassuring reprimand or two, deliberately held back, simply shaking her head with a smile. Matty was a good painter. It was sad that she felt so little compulsion these days to do it. Being someone's personal assistant didn't suit her. She was almost certainly lousy at it, but it paid for her rent and cigarettes, and chocolate. Judging from the blotchy pallor of her sister's face, she'd been consuming little else. "Just you take care," Jane said softly, leaning forward to brush her fingers across Matty's marbled cheek. "And how about you, big sis? Are you well?" Matty stood up and put her sunglasses on as she asked the question. "Me? Oh, I'm fine. replied Jane automatically, staring up at the giant reflector lenses, seeing a warped image of herself, a hunched woman in a chair. Then quite suddenly, she started to cry. Terrible tears that simply spilled down her face of their own accord. "Jane, what the—" Mattie quickly knelt beside her and took her hands. Then Julia noticed that something was wrong and came leaping to her other side, waving a handkerchief. Jane felt spectacularly embarrassed and acutely aware of Michael sitting helpless in his chair, watching the scene of his weeping wife and the clucking women probably with horror. She knew herself that it was a truly dreadful thing to do, to burst into tears at a Sunday lunch for no reason at all. But it had crept up on her out of nowhere, stealthy and appalling, like a sudden sickness. And once she had started, it took several minutes to stop. She blew her nose hard on Julia's immaculately ironed hanky. "I'm sorry, all of you. I don't know what got into me." "Don't tell me. Who's my new sunglasses? I can take it. I'll burn them the minute I get home." "Dear Matt, I love your glasses." "Would a drink help?" It was the first thing Michael had said. "Thank you, Michael, but I'm fine now." There was an expectant pause, as if all three of them were waiting. Julia and Mattie left soon afterwards. At the door, Jane laughed reassuringly with them and blamed it all on hormones. "I'll call you," said Julie with a firm look. "What was all that about?" Michael asked when they had gone. I don't know." Jane concentrated hard on clearing the table, instinct telling her that she had something to hide, though quite what she wasn't sure. Nobody just burst into tears without there being some kind of reason for it. Michael stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded across his broad chest, his strong, square face set in an expression of vigorous determination. "I suppose I suddenly felt sad." "Crying and sadness are commonly associated, this is true." The impatience in his tone made her rattle the plates. Upstairs, Harriet began to cry in her cot. "Perhaps you could be a little more explicit? After all, I don't think your behaviour could exactly be described as normal." "Normal?" Jane looked at him for an instant before returning her attention to stacking plates. "I don't know, Michael, I don't know," she burst out, feeling close to tears again. "I'm sorry, but that's the truth of it." "Steady on, we don't want to scare the children with all this hysteria, do we?" Tom was standing beside his father, holding a complicated Lego construction up for approval. For an instant, Jane felt that the child understood more than the man, that he was tuned into her in a way so deep that it made Michael a mere stranger by comparison. "I say, you're not pregnant, are you?" he went on, holding Tom's creation but not looking at it. "No, Michael, I'm not pregnant. There are other reasons that women cry." She wiped the table mats and stacked them back into the box, the sides of which were badly battered and held together with stiff, ageing sellotape. They had been a wedding present from some distant relative of Michael's who now lived in New Zealand. Brilliantly coloured birds of the world, laminated so securely that their plumage shone with as much brightness as they had on the day they were unpacked. "Good. A baby is about the last thing we need." "It's a space rocket!" said Tom for at least the fourth time, but very loudly now so that Michael had to respond and Jane could escape. At least it felt like escape, as she sidled past the two of them and got on with the immediate demands of her daughter and a messy kitchen. But all through the domestic chores of that day and the rest of the week, the unprompted outburst of crying sat in Jane's mind like an unanswered question. She was greatly alarmed by it. To have embarrassed herself was bad enough, but far worse was the sense of not having been in control. Some fundamental ground in her life was shifting, and she was losing her balance. Chapter 4. "You need a break," remarked Julia a couple of weeks later, in a tone of voice that was both scolding and kind. "Too much bloody domesticity, baby dribble and Hoover bags. It drives most women to drink in the end. Lay down the rubber gloves and demand a holiday for yourself." "Oh, Julia, I can't." Jane was trimming the fatty edges off some pork chops. The telephone was wedged between her ear and shoulder, causing considerable neckache, since the conversation, "I know you won't," which is quite a different thing. "Michael would have a fit, and who would look after the children, and where would I go?" "Rent a nanny from one of those agencies and go to a health farm. Tell Michael it's that or a divorce." She laughed. "Be bold, woman, demand your rights." Jane sighed, not in the mood for her friend's flippant confidence. "Rights are complicated things when you're married, and anyway, all your suggestions are outrageously expensive. It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Jane," she retorted. "You're going woolly-headed, that's all. You're not seeing anything beyond the wallpaper." Even for Julia this was curt. Well, thanks for the advice. Don't go all defensive. Tell me to shut up or bugger off, but don't curl up in that bulletproof shell of yours. It's very distressing for those of us left outside in the cold. Jane put the phone back on its wall slot, next to her shelf of kitchen jars, feeling dazed and alone. Once upon a time it had been easy to love Michael. She looked at the pile of raw pork in front of her, pink and moist, streaked with white fat, and wondered if human flesh looked like that beneath the skin. These days love did not come to her fresh and inspirational as it once had. Now it was a stale, remembered feeling that she had to dig from her mind with force. She started to cut the meat for the stew, but her knife was blunt and the pork resisted, its fatty streaks so interwoven with the pink flesh that she could not separate them. The fat with the meat, she thought, the rough with the smooth, for better for worse, and she gave up on her task, tearing the meat into big pieces and throwing them into the pan regardless. Michael must have missed his train. Outside, a failing sun was casting its light beams across the garden, illuminating the spring green of the grass and making the young faces of the leaves stand out against the dusky sky like jewels on metal. The blurred screen of a television flickered on in the upstairs room of the house next door. From the other side of the fence, the hollering of an angry child broke the stillness of the evening. Jane, whose own children had been asleep for half an hour at least, took a glass of wine and sat in one of the patio chairs, still parked at odd angles from the not entirely successful Sunday lunch a couple of weeks before. The chair's once shiny metal frame was now thick with rust, orange speckled with black and brown. She rubbed and picked at the worst patches with her fingers, knowing it was futile, but wanting the shine to return. After a while she gave up and checked her watch, before going to the little shed beyond the oak tree at the bottom of the garden, where she had hidden a pack of 10 cigarettes and a lighter behind an old paint tin. Having lit one, she inhaled slowly, closing her eyes, enjoying the dry burning at the back of her throat and the faint sensation of giddiness. Perhaps Julie was right. Perhaps some time alone was all she needed. Time and uninterrupted sleep. Jane took another drag, aware of the smell of garlic and onions on her hands and the tiny shreds of pork still stuck under her fingernails. The faint sound of a slamming door gave her a jolt. She hastily dropped the cigarette and set off back towards the house, balancing on the balls. "Oh, there you are." "My God, Michael, you startled me. I thought you'd be on the later train." "So I can still surprise you after all these years." He was in a good mood, smiling, saying nothing about the cigarette, though he only kissed her on the nose. "They've changed the train times. British Rail strikes again, so to speak." He sniffed the air, which smelt of mint, sole survivor of an inherited erstwhile herb bed, mixed with smoke. "The garden isn't looking too bad." He tugged a small twist of bindweed from the nearest shrub and put it in his pocket. "What's for supper?" "Pork, a sort of stew." He blew vigorously on his hands and rubbed them together. "Great, it's bloody cold out here. Let's get inside." "It's not that cold. It's lovely. I was going to sit with my drink for a bit." "Really?" He gave a snort and stomped back inside, only to return a couple of minutes later wearing an anorak and bringing the wine bottle and a glass with him. He placed them carefully on the table before sitting down in the chair nearest hers. "Good day?" "More or less. Children all right?" Tom wailed at the school gates and Harriet lunged at the shelves of the supermarket like a mini sumo wrestler, so pretty normal all round. "What about you?" "Monstrously busy." "You always say that." "That's because it's always true. Will supper be ready yet?" He patted his stomach, which was flattish but soft. "Should we talk about our marriage instead of supper?" "Whatever for?" "It might be interesting." "I highly doubt it," Michael laughed, pouring himself some wine. There is a terrible complacency in his aspect, which struck Jane with such force that for a moment she could not speak. Had it always been there, she wondered, or had it edged into him, an early teasing component of what he would become? "Why are you in such a good mood anyway? Have you been given a pay rise or found a mistress or something?" she countered, with a wicked urge to knock all the smugness out of him. But Michael looked even more pleased, enjoying her banter. "No such luck on either count, I'm afraid." He stretched as he grinned, thinking of the crisp perfection of Antonia's presentation and the neat pleated slit at the back of her pinstripe skirt. "Perhaps I feel good because I'm almost 35 and not yet bald or fat or poor or lonely. Those are all negatives. It's not the same as saying I'm slim and rich and surrounded by people I adore." She eyed the thick curls of his hair. "You're certainly not bald." "And I do adore you." He reached out and patted her hand. Jane sat unmoving, unable to respond, suddenly rigid with cold. It wasn't enough and it wasn't true. Michael adored her according to his moods, If he felt good, he said he adored her. It had nothing to do with love. She withdrew her hand and cupped her wineglass to her chest, staring into the yellowy liquid, watching a bobbing fragment of cork on its surface. "I'm starving, and Christ, now it is cold." He jumped up from his chair and walked briskly down the garden to where, holding it as he might a dead worm, before hurling it into the mass of variegated ivy that grew along, through and round their garden fence in a collage of greens. Jane went inside to boil some water for peas. Why was trying to talk about the real things so hard, she wondered, when in many ways they know each other so well? Once it had been simple enough. When her parents were killed and Mattie went off the rails, Michael had empowered her. Just the sound of his voice had been soothing. She had loved his unflurried rationality, the way he weighed up what had to be done, assessed things, sorted them out, tackled them head-on without fear. Though she put on a sweatshirt and sat in the kitchen chair nearest the radiator, the cold had entered her and would not leave. The pork had turned brown and tender at the mercy of the oven, but all Jane saw was pink flesh and squidgy ridges of fat. It was like seeing into the heart of the things, and it made her feel sick and sad. Chapter 5. Julia banged the side of the steering wheel with the flat of her gloved hand, and then resignedly pushed the gear stick into neutral. She should have gone another way, along the embankment and across one of the city bridges perhaps. After scowling at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she looked again to check her makeup. The colour on her lips was very red. Too red. She pressed them together several times and then dabbed at the edges with a tissue from her pocket. The driver in the car behind pressed his horn. The Hammersmith traffic had shifted forward by 5 feet at least, and she hadn't even noticed. Her fingers reached for the radio but stopped short. Her car had been broken into the week before and all its contents swiped, even the floppy box of tissue she kept on top of the dashboard and a shapeless mohair sweater that her mother had knitted years before, which she hated but couldn't throw away. Without the distraction of music or news, Julia found herself mulling over the prospect of the evening before her. She was almost as baffled about being on the guest list as she was about why Pippa Croft should have taken it upon herself to organise such a party in the first place. Celebrating promotions was surely a wife's job. She had said as much to Jane, who was irritatingly pragmatic about it. Pippa was on an up, she explained, looking for reasons to be jolly, and if that included throwing surprise parties for Michael, then that was fine by her. Julie had wondered then, as she did now, whether her friend spoke the truth. She couldn't work Jane out at the moment. She couldn't get her to talk any more, either to complain or to have a laugh. Everything was fine, she kept saying, her lips closing on the words like a portcullis. It had been hard enough maintaining a friendship like theirs over the years, given all the hoops of marriage and motherhood that Jane had chosen to fling over herself. They had had to work at it, the two of them, like some offbeat married couple who only met when other commitments allowed. As a result, the intense intimacy of their student years had been stretched and moulded into something rather more dilute. Sometimes Julie even feared that the friendship only survived by virtue of what had gone before. There was so little now to fuel it. By the time Julia accelerated across the relative freedom of Wandsworth Bridge, she was already late for the party. She whistled quietly at her own audacity as she shot through a red light and turned onto the South Circular. The evening might be fun after all. Mattie was going to be there, as was Michael's brother, Christopher, whom she hadn't seen for years, and a man called Des, who was a friend of Michael and Tim's from way back, and whom she vaguely recollected as being quite amusing. Since it was some time since she had experienced anything approximating to a relationship with a man, Julie could not help allowing herself a heartbeat of speculation at renewing such acquaintances. As Julia Durnford's looks had emerged from the challenging cocoon of late adolescence, she had discovered the fundamental and most disturbing fact that to be what society regarded as classically attractive was frequently the most terrible burden. There was little she could do about it. No visual aids or clever dressing were required to draw attention to her glassy blue eyes and lustrous blonde hair. And her figure was the racehorse kind, that breed apart, with naturally toned long legs, strong hips, a slim waist and broad shoulders. Men, it seemed, read from an entirely different score when presented with such looks. The most obviously desirable qualities in a partner, or at any rate the ones Julia found herself scanning for, such as sincerity, understanding, and an equal capacity for intellectual as well as sexual pastimes, were invariably buried under much less enticing features, possessiveness, vanity, and insecurity being the most striking traits of the men she had attracted so far. In short, practically all her affairs had been a disaster, apart from one with a married man, which she tried not to remember, and from which she had eventually extricated herself, with more regret than she had ever before experienced or wished to know again. The Croft sitting room, with all its sweeps, folds and tucks of flowery cottons, reminded Jane of a Laura Ashley furnishing shop. Although several years had passed since Pippa had designed it, the effect was still crisp and new. A picture-perfect garden of silky pastel shades, unsullied by grubby finger marks and juice dribbles. To complete the picture, Pippa floated amongst the floral scene like some pre-Raphaelite flower girl, one of those one-gowned women on the arty calendars that Jane and Mattie had brought each other as birthday presents in their early teens. In honour of the occasion, Pippa's long, limp tresses had been loosely, but very carefully, pinned to the top of her head so that long wisps fell down about her ears and neck, trailing decorously amongst the large hoops of her earrings. Her dress, like her curtains, was covered with flowers and swept almost to the ground. Jane, who wore a plain silk shirt and baggy black trousers, felt, with a familiar jolt, the chasm that separated her from the wife of her husband's oldest friend. "This is wonderful, Pippa. You've gone to so much trouble." "I never guessed. I thought we were going to the bloody cinema," said Michael, not for the first time, slapping his knee and looking happily round the room at the small group of people Pippa had invited to celebrate the latest success in his career. "He was hell to get out of the house," put in Jane, touched, in spite of herself, by Michael's obvious delight at Pippa's surprise party. "I could never have organised it without your help, Jane. You've been a marvel," said Pippa happily, picking up a plate of enticing miniature vol-au-vents to take round the room. "I've done nothing," said Jane truthfully. Had Pippa hesitated at all before suggesting the party, she wondered suddenly, and why did it bother her, as Michael's wife, so little? Life was so much easier if you just let it sweep you along, that was the truth. It was amazing how many things seemed to happen of their own accord. "How are everyone's drinks?" asked Pippa, clapping her hands to vent some of her panic about the evening in general, and the meal in particular. She'd written down exactly when each dish had to go in and out of the oven, but still kept forgetting. The real intention behind the dinner, so simple in conception, had been as a pretext for cheering Tim up, stirring him out of what had become unremitting glumness. But her plan, perhaps wavering under the weight of the secret hopes heaped upon it, was refusing to cooperate. Michael appeared cheerful enough, but Tim's contribution to the festivities had so far amounted to little more than a menacing silence, one of those that made Pippa sure she had done something wrong, something as yet unidentified but wholly unforgivable. Des had added greatly to these anxieties by bringing a very young and noisily confident girlfriend, barely out of university by the look of her. The prawns had shrunk alarmingly from grilling and were going to have to be spread very thinly indeed, as was the homemade garlic mayonnaise, which had curdled twice and which she wished she'd never started. The book said the salmon only needed 40 minutes, but it had looked...